All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director of the Fine Art Museums, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. And thank you for coming in on when you could be at the Strictly Bluegrass Festival or in soaking in this extraordinary heat wave. But we're very happy to see you here for the inaugural lecture of our exhibition, Mary Cassatt at Work. Many of you will know that it's the 150th anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. And a number of exhibitions have taken place around the world, including a big show that's now opening at the National Gallery in Washington about the Impressionists. And I'm very happy that our contribution to this sort of celebration is an exhibition of the only American who exhibited with the Impressionists, a woman at that. Mary Cassatt's work is now so familiar through reproduction that it's sometimes hard to kind of get back and to understand quite how innovative it was in its time. A woman depicting women at work, women with children, at a time when this was not typical subject matter. Nor do we realize quite how innovative and groundbreaking many of her technical processes were. And so it's a real delight that in this exhibition, we're able to kind of strip away the decades and get back to those years of her work and to really see her with fresh eyes. I'm especially happy that we have this exhibition in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of the Legion of Honor, because 100 years ago, another visionary woman, Alma Bretteville de Spreckels, and her husband conceived and built the Legion of Honor. And we're kicking off a year of celebration of the contribution that the Legion has made as a center of art and culture and conversation and inspiration in the Bay Area with this exhibition. And on the weekend of November the 9th and 10th, which is actually the 100th anniversary, we will have the museum is always open for free on Saturdays, thanks to Mrs. Wilsey and our free Saturday program. But in addition, thanks to Bank of America, the exhibition will be free that weekend as well. So do please tell your friends and come to the celebrations. We'll also be kicking off, inaugurating a curatorial lecture program on that Saturday that will be kicked off by Emily Beeny. So with that, I'm going to quickly move on and introduce Emily and the other speaker this afternoon, Nikki Georgopulos. Before I do that, I just want to thank our colleagues in Philadelphia who are such great collaborators on this exhibition. And as any of you who've seen the show will see, it's absolutely beautiful. Many people worked to really pull off just the perfect installation. So I hope you'll all enjoy it if you haven't already seen it. There's also a wonderful film, both in the exhibition and online. So do please share it, tell your friends. Now with that, I'm happy to introduce our speakers today. Emily Beeny is Chief Curator of the Legion of Honor and the Barbara A. Wolfe Curator in charge of European paintings. Emily is a specialist in French paintings and drawings of the 17th to 19th centuries. She received her PhD from Columbia University and arrived in San Francisco in 2021, having previously served in curatorial positions at the Getty Museum, the Norton Simon Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Musée d'Orsay. At the Fine Art Museums, she has overseen curatorial planning for the Legion of Honor's centennial celebration, including key acquisitions and gallery installations, a lecture series, and the writing of several hundred new labels for objects in our galleries. She is the San Francisco curator for Mary Cassatt at Work, but is also hard work on two major exhibitions for the future, one on the artistic friendship of Édouard Manet and Berthe Morisot, and another on the great 17th century Caravagesque painter, Simon Vouet. Our co-speaker this afternoon is Nikki Georgopulos, who is an assistant professor of art history at the University of British Columbia. Her research focuses on European art of the 19th century and the definition of realism. She's published extensively on the work of Mary Cassatt, looking particularly at Cassatt's interest and investment in the question of work, as well as her involvement in the women's suffrage movement. Nikki received her PhD from Stony Brook University and served as the Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow in the Department of French Painting at the National Gallery of Art. She has consulted on and contributed to exhibitions at the National Gallery, the Musée d'Orsay, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She has also held research and teaching positions at the Morgan Library, the International Foundation for Art and Research, and the City College of New York. So with that, over to our speakers, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction, and so many thanks to all of you for being here with us at the Legion today and online as well. I have to say, it's really an honor and a delight to share this magnificent exhibition with West Coast audiences. I'm full of gratitude to our colleagues in Philadelphia, Jennifer Thompson and Laurel Garber, for developing the first North American Cassatt retrospective in 25 years. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Professor Georgopulos, who is one of the leading Cassatt specialists of our generation, for a discussion of the artist's fierce professional identity and her relationship to the rise of working women in the later 19th century. But I thought we could start out with a brief introduction to the exhibition, which follows the contours of Cassatt's mature career and explores her iterative, experimental working methods. For undercover of acceptably feminine subject matter, Cassatt produced images of women's work, by which I mean knitting and needlepoint, bathing children, nursing infants, that also testified to the work of the woman who made them. The marks of her brush, of her etching needle, of her pastel stick, and even her fingertips. Try to advance to the next slide. Thank you. Hooray. Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. So I imagine that even of those of you who have not yet ventured into the galleries may be familiar with this image. Flopped unself-consciously in an overstuffed chair, Cassatt's little girl regards her furry companion, one of the artist's long line of griffin dogs, with a weary expression. I'd argue that today it's rather difficult for us truly to see this painting in all its original strangeness and radicalism. Our idea, of course, is refracted through innumerable reproductions we've encountered on coffee mugs and greeting cards, on wall calendars, children's books, maybe even on the wall of a dentist's office waiting room. Tamed into something sweet, the image has lost something of its original punch, the sense that here is a disobedient picture of a disobedient girl, painted by a disobedient girl, a picture of a child absorbed in her own experience who doesn't arrange herself for our gaze. A picture painted with broad, slashing strokes of paint that threaten to explode the patterned textile of this upholstery into a burst of abstract color. A picture rejected by the fine arts jury for the 1878 Paris World's Fair and defiantly shown the following spring in Cassatt's first outing with the Impressionist group. One goal of this exhibition, as Tom mentioned, is to help excavate the original radicalism of such works, whose familiarity can at first blind us until, that is, we look more closely into the work of making, a serious business for Cassatt. Seen here in a portrait by her friend and fellow impressionist Édouard Degas, Cassatt said that she wished to leave behind superior art and a hidden personality. Though, of course, her unusual personality and life story do play a determining role in the development of her superior art. Born in 1844 in Allegheny City, today part of Pittsburgh, Cassatt grew up in a well-to-do family. Her father was a successful stockbroker. Her brother would go on to serve as president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Women in her family didn't work in the sense we usually use this word today. The most physically taxing aspects of keeping house and caring for children were generally carried out by domestic employees. Though many young ladies of Cassatt's social class did study drawing and even painting as genteel accomplishments, her ambition to pursue art as a profession set her apart and faced some stiff headwinds in a culture that expected its daughters principally to marry well and bear children. Cassatt herself would do neither. She began her formal training at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts while still a teenager. And then in the 1860s, traveling with her family, she continued her studies in Paris under the tutelage of Thomas Couture, Jean-Léon Gérôme, and Charles Chaplin, examples of whose work from our own collection we see here. At this moment, women were not yet admitted into the École des Beaux-Arts, the official training academy in France, but Cassatt's study with these artists laid a strong foundation in draftsmanship, unusual for a woman of her generation. She began showing her work at the annual state-sponsored Salon exhibition in 1868, but was driven back to the United States just over a year later by the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. After languishing for many months in rural Pennsylvania, she obtained a commission to paint copies after Correggio in Italy, setting off once more for the continent in 1871. From Italy, she traveled to Spain, collecting picturesque subject matter for a number of genre paintings destined for the Salon, where she showed successfully from 1872 to 1876. She settled permanently in Paris in 1874, living independently with her sister Lydia at first, before she was joined by her parents in a penthouse apartment not far from the Place Pigalle. Her arrival in Paris coincided with the formal launch of the Impressionist movement, whose independent group exhibitions Cassatt surely attended, and whose experiments with a brighter palette and looser paint handling encouraged her own evolution. In the space of just 6 years, she passed from something that looked like this, so that is to say tight, accomplished, somewhat conventional, to something that looked like this, bright and sketch-like, with impatient strokes of paint that suggest shifting, shimmering light. As Cassatt's work became more avant-garde, the Salon jury began to look less kindly on her submissions. When Édouard Degas, already a prominent member of the dissident group, invited her to show in the 4th Impressionist exhibition in 1879, she accepted, abandoning the Salon forever. She would participate in all but one of the 4 remaining Impressionist shows and would become one of the most effective international advocates for la nouvelle peinture, the new painting, as the movement was coming to be known. The 1879 exhibition was held in the Avenue de l'Opéra, a broad boulevard culminating in the new Parisian Opera House, and Cassatt included in her submissions a number of pictures portraying chic opera-goers in velvet-lined boxes. Degas, likewise, drew inspiration from the Opera House that year for pictures like this one, but while his submissions looked to ballet dancers on stage, Cassatt's looked to the audience and to members of her own social class. Cassatt and Degas likewise shared an interest in pastel, whose matte, powdery surfaces and unadulterated pigments opened up rich formal possibilities. A detail of this pastel shows where Cassatt adjusted the edge of the fan, a tricky maneuver in brilliant, powdery pastel. The revision is visible to the naked eye, an example of the restless, iterative approach that is really most evident in Cassatt's printmaking. Coming out of the exhibition, she, Degas, and their friend Camille Pissarro planned a journal of Impressionist prints, Le Jour et la Nuit, Day and Night, which was never realized, but which sparked Cassatt's first real exploration of printmaking, the arena in which she would ultimately make her most lasting mark. So in sizing and scraping and burnishing and dusting and heating and reworking her copper printing plates, coated in varnish, Cassatt experimented to achieve a wide range of tone and texture, similar to what she had achieved in paint and pastel to that point. Sequentially pulled states of individual prints from this period give us a sense of their restless evolution, as the artist pulled proof after proof, returning again and again to the plate to rework and revise. Here we see 4 states of a print from the Opera House series, with progressive changes that pick out the model's expression, then the patterns in her fan, and finally the gaslit faces of the crowd in the opposite balcony. Cassatt had cut a deal with her father quite early on, stipulating that her art had to pay for itself. So that is that the sale of her pictures had to cover the costs of models and materials and studio space. Perhaps in part as a result, Cassatt's most frequent model in her early Impressionist career was her sister and sometime roommate, Lydia, an unpaid model who often posed with a book, a newspaper, a bit of knitting or needlework. Such activities, I think, offered a pretty obvious means of keeping an amateur model still. But Lydia's intentness on her task here, her hands a blur of movement below the tapestry screen, also serves to remind us of the artist's own rapt attention, the rapid movement of her brush across the canvas as she sat, painting opposite her sister. Lydia was not the only member of the Cassatt family enlisted as a model. A transatlantic visit from the artist's brother, Alexander, and his children helped spark Cassatt's interest in painting juvenile subjects, like the grave little Robert Cassatt perched on the arm of his father's chair. In reality, the painter recalled that her nephew struggled to sit still during his sessions, hopping about like a flea. Cassatt would continue to depict her nephews and nieces, the children of friends and neighbors, for years to come, sometimes pairing them with adult models drawn from her own domestic staff, working-class women paid to play the role of bourgeois mothers in carefully crafted studio scenes. Shown at the 6th Impressionist exhibition in the spring of 1881, this pastel evokes a moment of extraordinary tenderness, perhaps between 2 such models. A single line of salmon pink conjures the heat and pressure of the toddler's cheek against that of the young woman, while brief touches of color suggest the contrasting textures of the woman's auburn chignon and the child's hair as fine as corn silk. Electric strokes of green and pink indicate the striped wallpaper and blur out the surrounding room, intensifying what one contemporary critic called the penetrating sense of intimacy conveyed by these 2 figures that seem to merge into one. Cassatt took genuine interest in the inner lives and private world of children, stocking her studio with toys and observing her young models absorbed in the work of play. Here note the intentness of the little girls, their flushed cheeks and lowered lashes, the pudgy, determined grip of their little hands. Here it's perhaps worth remembering that the artist had no children of her own. The kind of professional ambition she harbored was incompatible with family life for a woman of Cassatt's time and social class. There's a sense in which her poignant evocations of children were underwritten by her own childless state. At the end of the 1880s, Cassatt carried over her new pictorial concerns, especially her interest in portraying children and childcare, into her work as a printmaker. In 1889, she took the unusual step of buying a printing press for her home studio, a giant, heavy piece of equipment that would allow her to pull impressions of her own designs. Among the first fruits of this investment was a set of 12 magisterial dry points, whose subjects range from the artist's pet parrot, Coco, to scenes of dressing, bathing, and nursing children. Executed in the unforgiving dry point technique, which involves scratching with a needle directly into an uncoated copper plate, these designs are as spare and linear as Italian Renaissance metal point drawings, the ultimate expression of Cassatt's mastery as a draftswoman, and a signal of her change in direction at this moment, away from the looser approach of her high Impressionist period toward a more classical, monumental, linear approach in her later work. The dry points are also a prelude to Cassatt's greatest achievement as a printmaker, perhaps her greatest achievement as an artist, a series of color prints executed from 1890 to 91, from which we see a superb example in the Achenbach collection here. In the spring of 1890, Cassatt attended an exhibition of Japanese woodblock prints at the École des Beaux-Arts. She was especially taken, I think, with the work of Kitagawa Utamaro, by whom we see prints here of a woman at her toilette and another bathing a child. Captivated by their bright colors, their bold patterns, and their alertness to details of everyday life, Cassatt came away from the exhibition determined to reverse engineer these same effects in a Western style intaglio print. The following winter, she produced a series of color prints, now known as the Set of 10, using a sequence of carefully aligned copper plates to carry the various colors and portions of each design. These works draw inspiration from Japanese woodblock precedents to portray the private lives of modern Parisian women, bedtime and toilette rituals, the bathing of a child, the sharing of a cup of tea, the sealing of a letter, a dress fitting, a bus ride, a quiet moment at a party. The first print in the series was The Bath, portraying a woman testing the temperature of water in a tub before bathing a squirmy toddler. The exhibition presents 12 versions of this composition, allowing us essentially to look over Cassatt's shoulder, observing the process of trial and error through which she arrived at the finished composition. We watch her struggle with registration problems and the appropriate printing order for the various plates, even as she adds lines and color, the pattern of the dress, the ripples in the water, and so on. One side effect of this iterative process is that when the states are arrayed together on the wall, they seem to echo the repetitive nature of the task they depict. Bedtime, too, is iterative, happening over and over again, night after night after night. The successive states of Cassatt's color prints testify both to the artist's restless experimentation and to her desire to document that experimentation, preserving the process as well as the finished product. A related interest in laying process bare emerges in the large number of surviving pastels and paintings from Cassatt's later career that exhibit a tension between tightly rendered, highly finished passages and areas of looser, more open facture. Solid heads and bodies often give way to broad strokes of color, and even blank stretches of canvas or paper along the edges of Cassatt's compositions as her designs dissolve into their constituent marks and materials. Such works seem to invite us into the process of their own making, allowing us essentially to eavesdrop on the artist as she applies hatches of pastel and strokes of paint. Of course, Cassatt was still finishing pictures in this period, as this exquisitely accomplished scene of a young woman in a garden with an infant and child demonstrates. Shown in the artist's first solo exhibition at the Galerie Durand-Ruel, the greatest dealer in Impressionist paintings, this picture exemplifies the monumental classical turn of Cassatt's work at the moment when she was developing a giant mural on the theme of modern woman for the Columbian Exposition, a World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893. Here, the rigorous line of Cassatt's dry point series finds an expression in paint, with the carefully described and contained forms of the baby and the caregiver's hands. The composition pays explicit homage to Italian Renaissance paintings of the Madonna and Child, either with St. John the Baptist, or perhaps more specifically in this case, with St. Catherine, so the mystic marriage of St. Catherine. This example by Correggio is one that Cassatt would have known in the Louvre, and it demonstrates, I think, how Cassatt's increasing focus on images of mothers and children helped establish a dialogue with the old masters she had copied and revered since her earliest training. But her increasingly single-minded return to the mother and child theme and her ability to wring endless variety out of this theme also ties Cassatt's later work to that of her contemporaries. Regarding her pairs and trios of mothers, babies, and children, we might do well to remember the endless Mont Sainte-Victoire landscapes of Cézanne and the recurring water lily ponds of Monet. Painted in these very same years, but not weighted with the same gendered meaning as the source of Cassatt's inspiration, these subjects have not led the men who chose them to be written off as repetitive, much less commercial or sentimental. Tea, clothes, and nursery, nursery, clothes, and tea. So goes the cliched critique of Cassatt's work. Of course, Cassatt was a canny marketer of her own pictures, a woman artist of means who understood what might be expected of her by the market as a woman artist of means. But the reassuring femininity of her chosen subjects has tended to I think, conceal their radical newness, matched by her equally radical and new approach to the work of art making, the experiments with color and line that gave expression to her images of modern women. I'm going to hand it over to Nikki. Thanks.
What an impossibly hard act to follow. Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be able to share a little bit more about Cassatt with you, an artist whom I love dearly and deeply, and what a joy to do so on the occasion of this incredible exhibition that I hope you've all had the chance to see, and my hope being, of course, that this will drive you back into the galleries to look again. Just to give you a little bit of warning and contextualization, you might hear some of the same ideas and themes and even facts that Emily has just laid out for us in my talk, but mine will be a bit more historical and perhaps a bit more biographical. So I lack the very juicy images that we got to see just now. But in any case, thanks for being here and for your attention. In the spring of 1864, the 21-year-old Mary Cassatt was fitful with zealous energy. Writing to her friend and fellow aspiring artist Eliza Haldeman, she urged her, "Now please, don't let your ambitions sleep, but finish your portrait so that I may bring it to town with me and have it framed with mine, sent to the exhibition with mine, hung side by side with mine, be praised, criticized with mine, and finally, that some enthusiastic admirer of art and beauty may offer us $1,000 apiece for them." Picture it, think of it. Cassatt's frantic prodding, tethered always to the success of her own painting, is characteristic of her letters of this period. Unabashedly ambitious, hell-bent on success, measured by fame and fortune, Cassatt was determined from a young age to make her mark on art history. Mary Cassatt at Work, a landmark exhibition of her paintings, drawings, pastels, and prints at a scale not seen in over 2 decades, is a testament to her triumph. Today, I want to chart how that ambition shaped her life and career, to give both some biographical and some historical context to the show's central theme of work. So let's rewind a bit to the spring of 1860. Just a month shy of her 16th birthday, Cassatt enrolled in her first drawing class at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, or PAFA, in Philadelphia. I love the fact that hers was the very first name on the registration list. I can't help but love a teacher's pet. Having been born into a comfortably wealthy and worldly family in 1844, Cassatt's childhood was one surrounded by art, both in the households of family friends in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and through her family's extensive travels throughout Europe. Cassatt came of age at the dawn of the passenger steamship and the rapid expansion of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most prominent transportation enterprises in the world, of which Cassatt's brother Alexander would go on to become president. Cassatt grew up in motion, moving in, around, and through one of the nation's liveliest cities, and would carry that sense of momentum with her throughout her long life and career. Starting at PAFA, then, we can imagine her itching with ambition. Her early letters, as we've already heard, crackle with youthful energy. At the time of her enrollment, PAFA was the most prestigious and progressive art school in the United States. Founded in 1805, it followed the French model, serving both as an exhibition venue and the training ground for budding artists. And tragically, it was recently announced that it will be closing next year. PAFA was one of, if not the first major art academy to admit women as students, offering them a parallel program of study to men from studying plaster casts and live models. Cassatt joined the Academy in the midst of what is playfully referred to as the fig leaf era, where tight-fitting covers were applied to male nude casts to preserve the lady's propriety. Though such a gesture now reeks of ridiculous primness and paternalism, it was in fact an ingenious solution to the problem of the nude body, which was, at the time, considered the apex of artistic training and achievement. A compromise that satisfied the demands of decency, while also allowing women access to critical tools of study, even if they were partially obscured. This is all to say that PAFA was as cosmopolitan and urbane as a young woman could have hoped to attend it in the 1860s. And even so, our determined young Cassatt quickly grew frustrated with it. Despite the prestige, resources, and community that PAFA had to offer, the painter soon felt that she had outgrown it and was desperate to return to Europe, where, to her mind, the possibility of true artistic achievement lay. Though her departure was delayed by the final ravages of the American Civil War, by the end of 1865, Cassatt was in France, soon to be joined by Haldeman, her friend and fellow PAFA student. Cassatt's determination to work and study on the European continent was not a flight of fancy, but was instead a strategic maneuver in pursuit of her long-term goals. Cassatt spent the next 5 years living and working all over France, studying with different teachers and visiting storied artist colonies, all with the aim of achieving what that was then a vital stepping stone to artistic success, admission into the French Salon. The Salon, sponsored by the French state and juried by the members of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, was at the time the clearinghouse for professional artists. Promising both prestige and exposure, it held a quasi-mythical place in Cassatt's imagination as a marker of achievement. Within 3 years of her arrival, Cassatt had achieved her goal. The mandolin player, Cassatt's Salon debut of 1868, is characteristic of her work from this period, the subject borrowing of the genre scenes favored by her then mentor Paul Soyer, her striking use of shadow in umber and cream signaling her interest in Spanish realism. It is significant, I think, in the context of this exhibition in particular, that Cassatt's first great success, by her own metrics, features a woman playing music, doing the work of producing art, much as she was. We might speculate that this contributed to her repeated return to the subject throughout her career, in paint, print, and pastel alike. Though her style would develop in significant ways in the decades that followed, not to mention abandoning the Salon for that ragtag bunch of rebels, the Impressionists, what is clear is that for Cassatt, her entrée into the official world of French art was a significant professional milestone. Indeed, I want to linger on this idea of professionalism a little longer, as it was a constant refrain for the ambitious Cassatt, often manifesting as an open disdain for its opposite, amateurism. In the year that followed her Salon debut, and evidently very much on her high horse, she wrote to her sister-in-law while on a sketching trip through the Swiss and French Alps, quote, "I am here with my friend, Miss Gordon, from Philadelphia, and we are roughing it most artistically," she reports. "We went to Aix-les-Bains, a very fashionable watering place entirely too gay for two poor painters, or at least for one, for although my friend calls herself a painter, she is only an amateur, and you must know, we professionals despise amateurs." Okay. That Cassatt would be so brutal about her friend, as we know, says more about her than it does the unfortunate Miss Gordon. Especially at this young age, Cassatt was possessed of a seemingly inescapable anxiety about being perceived as an amateur. While this was rooted in her personal ambitions, to be sure, it was also a function of a particular social atmosphere in which Cassatt was immersed. Women's work and the possibility of professionalism was the subject of great debate in a variety of fields on both sides of the Atlantic, but was especially potent in the realm of the arts. Cassatt's age, gender, class, and nationality were all working against her in her ambition to enter the annals of art history, particularly in a moment, and perhaps counterintuitively, when women were trying their hand at art making in unprecedented numbers. In the United States especially, women of Cassatt's social strata were enrolling in drawing courses in both large academies like PAFA and private studios. Drawing, printmaking, and painting were increasingly understood as respectable, even admirable skills in upper-class young ladies. The result was the emergence of a certain social trope of the lady painter, an amateur hobbyist who, while perhaps skilled, would never entertain wild notions of achieving any sort of greatness, which was solidly the purview of men. Cassatt, as you might imagine, bristled against this limited model of a woman artist, but her family wealth and class status made her a prime candidate. Pursuing further training and eventually exposure in Europe was, for Cassatt, a means of conveying her seriousness and dedication to her profession, setting her apart from the mere amateurs alongside whom she trained at PAFA. Imagine her annoyance, then, to find that private Parisian ateliers had also started catering to upper-class women from across the Atlantic, making the wealthy American lady painter a subtype all its own within France, and considerably raising the bar for Cassatt to set herself apart. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a parallel path was being forged for women of the working and lower middle classes, for whom certain visual arts, like illustration or textile work, were considered to be respectable sedentary means of earning money for their families that in no way posed a threat to their reputation or to their domestic responsibilities. Critically, in both the case of the well-to-do lady painter and the humble artisan, ambition to greatness was thoroughly hemmed in by social expectation. Artistic activity could never overtake a woman's duty to her family and the status quo, with which professional ambition was entirely incompatible. As one French official declared in a statement to a women's drawing academy in 1879, "We are not at all aiming in kindling in you an elated ambition for high art, which would lead you away from your true path. The pencil which we put in your hand here must not be an instrument of vanity and fame, but of modest facility and domestic happiness." Cassatt was thus stuck between a rock and a hard place. While her family's wealth meant that she did not need to work to survive, she abhorred the idea of being perceived as a lady amateur. She would also have not been content with the kind of artistic practice undertaken by women with real financial necessity, beset as she was by an indomitable snobbishness. And yet, she was not entirely free from financial constraint, as Emily was just telling us. Though her family was by and large, supportive of her career, one of the early conditions of her pursuits was that her artistic practice sustain itself, monetarily, of course. An 1878 letter from her father, Robert, grants us insight into these terms, as well as his daughter's feelings about them. Quote, "I have said that the studio must at least support itself. This makes Mary very uneasy, as she must either make sale of the pictures she has on hand, or else take to painting pot boilers, as the artists say, a thing that she has never yet done and cannot bear the idea of being obliged to do." Though she needed to make enough money to sustain her work, Cassatt could not stomach the idea of resorting to what her father calls here pot boilers, a derogatory period term for works of art that were made to boil the pot, so to speak, to feed oneself and one's family, thus sacrificing apparently artistic integrity or merit. Refusing to sell out to financial necessity, she was equally adamant that her career be perceived as anything less than absolutely professional. Even beyond this class conundrum, it was also the case that Cassatt understood financial success to be a meaningful marker of professionalism. Let's think back to that letter with which we began today, in which she urges Eliza Haldeman to not take her eyes off the prize, to continue working so that eventually some enthusiastic admirer of art and beauty may offer us $1,000 for their works. Cassatt's unabashed pursuit of fame and money as signs of success even appears within that which was one of perhaps her most ambitious works, a monumental mural made for the Women's Building of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Though now this mural is tragically lost, a reproduction allows us insight into what Cassatt understood to be the defining qualities of modern life for women. The mural, entitled Modern Woman, is composed of 3 panels, which, taken as a whole, offer a liberatory recuperation of the biblical story of Eve's temptation. In Cassatt's world, women are not condemned for plucking the fruit of the tree of knowledge, allegorized in the central panel, but are instead celebrated and lauded for their efforts. In the panel at left, a trio of young girls are caught in motion, chasing hungrily after the allegorical figure of fame, their ambition palpable in their outstretched hands. On the right, we see them enjoying the fruits of their labor, flaunting their success in art, music, and dancing. And here again, we find a musician, a banjo player, perhaps reminiscent of Cassatt's early success at the Salon. Cassatt's vision of modern woman, then, is one of harmonious collaboration that starts with ambition and ends in triumph, a feminist utopia in which women could forge their own path to happiness through their work, creativity, and mutual support. The artist and the mural's commissioners alike were well aware of the radical implications of this imagery. In the year leading up to the exposition, while hard at work on the mural in a country house outside of Paris, Cassatt wrote to the exhibition organizer, "An American friend asked me in a rather huffy tone the other day, 'Then this is woman, apart from her relations to man?' I told him it was. Men, I have no doubt, are painted in all their vigor on the walls of other buildings." She goes on then to declare her aims. "If I have not been absolutely feminine, then I have failed." Looking again to her central panel, which alongside happily the related color prints that survive, we can see that Cassatt's understanding of womanhood, that which was absolutely feminine, not only included but centered the task of work. Women and girls of varying ages work to harvest together, climbing the ladder, so to speak, and ensuring their self-sufficiency. While hardly an image of backbreaking labor, Cassatt's mural nevertheless posits work as the central task of a woman's life, the key to her thriving. This was not merely a declaration of some Protestant capitalist work ethic, but instead had serious political ramifications. For Cassatt, work held liberatory possibilities for women. Work was the key to women breaking out of the stifled roles in which the world kept them. Serious work, she once wrote, was the means by women could, quote, be someone and not something. It is no coincidence that it was around the time of the World's Columbian Exhibition that Cassatt started to develop what I would call a feminist consciousness. And in the early decades of the 20th century, she dedicated herself fervently to the cause of women's suffrage in the United States. In fact, Cassatt's insistence on the role of work in women's lives suggests her exposure also to French feminist thought at the time. While American first-wave feminism mostly focused its energies on the right to vote, French women's movements focused their energies instead on civil liberties, like the rights to divorce, education, and work. Since the mid-19th century, women's work had been a highly politicized topic in France, especially as the arrival of the Industrial Revolution saw more women entering the workforce. From the 1860s on, an atmosphere of moral panic about what it meant for a woman to work in this new era of factory labor stirred collective conversations about normative gender roles. It was in this time that a spate of paternalistic laws were passed regulating women's work, cloaked in the language of humanitarian concern for their well-being, but truthfully aimed at maintaining the status quo of keeping women in the home in their roles as wives and mothers. As one writer put plainly in 1861, a woman who becomes a worker is no longer a woman at all. Charming. Such thinking was symptomatic of what is referred to as the doctrine of separate spheres, a world in which public life, including that of work, was the domain of men, whereas women were confined to the realm of the domestic. Such ideas did not go uncontested. French feminist writers and activists understood that the freedom to work was bound up in the possibility of financial independence and was thus an integral step on the road to liberation. Cassatt's mural can thus be understood as responding to this collective debate and planting her flag firmly on one side as she places work and the pursuit of professional ambitions at the heart of her vision of modern womanhood. Indeed, this current exhibition occasions us to consider how Cassatt not only centered the question of women's work within her own artistic practice, but also how she collapses the binary imposed by this doctrine of separate spheres. Wet nurses and nannies, housemaids and seamstresses. Cassatt's working women expose the painfully obvious truth that for many women, home was the sphere of work. One suite of prints in particular suggests the permeability of these two worlds. In the omnibus from her celebrated set of 10 color prints from 1890 to 91, pictures a well-dressed woman clutching a parasol who casts a weather eye on the unseen space of the public omnibus or tram, her lips pursed in shrewd concentration. Beside her, a younger woman attends to a baby sitting placidly in her lap, the city of Paris acting as a backdrop. From their clothing and their physical proximity, we can surmise that the young woman is a nursemaid, a hired helper who helps care for the child whose mother travels along with them. That Cassatt places this trio firmly within the space of the modern city here is telling. The private feminine sphere disrupts the masculine metropolis. Moreover, changes that Cassatt made between her initial sketch and the final composition reveal the artist's attention to the gendered power dynamics at play. In the original sketch, which you can see here at left, Cassatt includes the figure of a man sitting shoulder to shoulder with the child's mother. Their physical proximity, as well as their complementary clothing, suggests that they are a pair, even as the woman looks away from him. Cassatt's ultimate erasure of the male figure here is significant. Not only does she maintain the public space of the omnibus as one entirely populated by women and children, so too does she transform the central woman from one who is accompanied to one who is doing the accompanying. Working in concert with her hired helper, she radiates confident authority and command of the space. She is the boss in every sense of the word. Cassatt's print reminds us that the two worlds of work and home could not be so easily separated, and they certainly were not for her, as her living and working spaces were nearly always contiguous. Her home studio, a marker of the extent to which her domestic life was almost entirely consumed by her professional pursuits. In 1894, having gained sufficient financial stability both from her professional success and from her family inheritance, Cassatt fulfilled a long-held dream of buying her own country home where she could install a permanent studio. Located in the town of Ménil-Théribus, the Château de Beaufresne was precisely what she had been hoping for, a place where she could live and work, where she could entertain guests but also invite models to sit, carrying out her personal and professional lives in tandem. And yet, mere months after purchasing it, she was ready to sell, frustrated with prolonged renovations. "I have given nearly 3 months of my time," she wrote to her dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, "and I know that I still have part of the summer to devote to giving orders. And I ask myself, when will I find the time to do a bit of painting? What I want is the freedom to work," she adds in exasperation. "Certainly that is the best thing in the world." Happily, Cassatt survived the pains of renovation and was able to live out most of the rest of her life in Beaufresne, moving only when she was forced to by the impending arrival of German soldiers at the onset of the First World War in 1914. By that time, her eyesight was starting to fail, and painting became ever more difficult. Eventually, she would be forced to give it up almost entirely, though she spent the last decade of her life working as an art advisor, helping to import Impressionism to the United States. And even so, her late correspondence brims with a desire to work. In a letter from January 1913, Cassatt gripes to a friend about shirking off social invitations. It is hard for me to keep up with people and work, she writes. Americans have a way of thinking that work is nothing. Come out and play, they say. By the end of that year, she would go on to confess to the physical toll of her indomitable ambition, writing, I have overlooked my bodily welfare, and I have worked so hard besides, and nothing takes it out of one like painting. Adding, on a somber note, I have only to look around me to see that, to see Degas a mere wreck, and Renoir and Monet too, referring to 3 of her fellow Impressionist painters. 3 years later, Edgar Degas would die, Auguste Renoir following not long after. Only Claude Monet would survive her, dying 6 months after Cassatt in 1926. But let us not end on this dour note. Cassatt would certainly have taken offense if we remembered her this way. Here was a woman absolutely committed to carving her name in stone, to entering the art history books and the halls of great museums like this one. Cassatt's artistic identity was a matter of legacy right from the start. Let's return to where we started, with the 20-something Cassatt exploding with vim and vinegar, running roughshod throughout Europe with her friend Eliza Haldeman. A letter from Haldeman home to her parents in the fall of 1867, before, notably, either of them had gained entry into the Salon, is particularly revelatory of Cassatt's lifelong ambition. She writes, Mary laughed when I told her your message and said she wanted to paint better than the old masters, Haldeman writes, referring, we can surmise, to a comment from Haldeman's parents that Cassatt might paint as well as the old masters. Throwing her hat into the ring of art history was a serious pursuit. By drawing our eye to the incredible artistic labor carried out by Cassatt throughout her career, Mary Cassatt at Work invites us to consider how the question of work arises in myriad ways throughout the artist's life and oeuvre, and how that, in turn, allows us to reconsider her art historical legacy. If we need any further proof of how strongly felt Cassatt's sense of artistic identity was, we need only look to her literal self-images. Cassatt carried out, as far as we know, 3 self-portraits in her lifetime. In the earliest, from 1878, she stares truculently off into the middle distance, her fine dress and à la mode chapeau lending a hint of irony to her very casual pose. She appears serious, fixated, almost impatient to escape her own sitting. The sense of hurry is even more keenly felt in a quickly executed watercolor and gouache sketch, Cassatt's busy hands obscured behind what we can infer to be an upright drawing board. The third and latest is more careful, fine lines and intricate shading shifting throughout multiple states of dry point. In stark contrast to such precision, Cassatt again renders her hands almost illegible, blurry, as if moving too quickly across the etching plate to capture clearly. Perhaps she was paying homage here to one of her great inspirations, Édouard Manet, who similarly captures the swift, busy work of his hands in his own self-portrait, representing them as a mass of swirling color. Whether or not she was thinking of Manet, Cassatt borrows from the visual vocabulary of artistic self-representation, as well as the other cultural association of the artist's hands as the physical embodiment of their workmanship. Cassatt's hands were always busy, moving with bravado with either brush or pen, carrying out the lifelong task of a woman's work. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for, oh, my goodness. Thank you for a fantastic talk. What a deep delight, and with so much rich context, I think, that I hope people will take back into the galleries with them. We're gonna just chat a little bit and then take questions from all of you. I think, Nikki, I would love to start with a question a lot of people have been posing to me. I think I know what your answer is to it, but people have been asking me, was Cassatt indeed a feminist? And I think that our answer to that question depends in part on the distinction between what it means to be a feminist may be in the United States in the 21st century, and what it meant to be a feminist as an American in France in the late 19th century.
Thanks. No, absolutely. And it's cheeky of me to use that term so casually, but I've started trying to do it just to build confidence a little, I think. So to be clear, Cassatt never identified as a feminist. To my knowledge, she never uses that term, but it was a word that was in circulation more commonly in France and in French at the time, but had quite a negative connotation, especially going back to the French Revolution. But I think if the metric for us is to understand the word feminist perhaps in its most basic form of someone who believes in the equity of genders, then she's a feminist. I understand that that's couched in a lot of historical baggage, and we have to understand and be specific about what we mean when we say that. But I think that we've had you spoke so eloquently about how her reputation and her gender have gotten in the way of us seeing her clearly. And I think a sort of fear on the part of scholars to recognize her radical political beliefs and a fear of you being anachronistic in applying the term feminism has gotten in the way of us seeing her work for what it was, which was quite radical, as you said.
Wonderful. Well, I have one more question for you before we take questions from the audience. I think you've evoked in this wonderful way Cassatt's references to the home as a workplace for domestic employees of various kinds. Can you speak a little bit to the role of Cassatt's class identity in her thinking about working women? I mean, obviously she identifies ferociously as a working woman herself, but to what extent, if at all, do you think she felt a sort of identification or shared cause with women of a very different social class whom she sometimes depicts?
That's a really great and difficult question to answer, and not one that I think I have a sort of affirmative answer to one way or the other, or a sort of concerted answer to. I think that she certainly thought of herself this way. She was, as you mentioned in your talk, she often brought young women and girls and children from the villages that she was living in, which were all working class, into her home to model for them. In a number of cases, she hires them to work in her household, so she understands their labor as something sort of fungible and fluid. And I think that she certainly thought of herself as a worker, but perhaps lacked the sort of clarity of class consciousness, let's say, to understand the differences between that kind of labor. But then again, I think it's telling that she uses in her mural, Modern Woman, she uses an image of agrarian labor, but she's dressed her women up in beautiful fine dresses, and this was something that critics came after her about quite a bit. And there's a wonderful letter to Degas that she writes about criticizing the way that she often would buy dresses for her models, her working class models to wear. And she says to him, "What, you don't find them worthy of these clothes?" And says that what draws her to them is their sense of vitality and energy, which are these sort of coded words to describe a working body. So in one sense, I think she has a sort of curiosity and perhaps a respect for women who actually worked, but she of course considered herself to be one as well.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we'd love to take questions from the audience if anybody has some for us. So the question here was that she finishes that she signs some unfinished works at the end of her life and leaves some works unsigned. How does she decide what to sign and what should go unsigned? Nikki, would you like to address this one? Well, there's a whole section in our exhibition that I hope you've gotten a chance to explore that really looks at the question of finish. When is a work of art finished by Cassatt's definition? And just as you say, there are many sort of sketch-like works, especially in the medium of pastel, that she signs and exhibits and considers finished right from the beginning. And I think that's evidence of her really sort of bold, progressive aesthetics, that she's kind of a modernist pioneer. But there are other works, especially oil paintings, that are really kind of abandoned, unfinished, and that years later, she goes back and reevaluates and adds a signature. And I think that process of reevaluation is largely prompted by a modernist dealer she's working with called Ambroise Vollard, who becomes famous as the dealer of Cézanne and Picasso, but who begins as, I always describe him as a little bit of a bottom feeder at the beginning of his career. He can't afford finished pictures, and so he builds a market for unfinished works. He goes around to artist studios and kind of buys up the scraps, and around to artist descendants, the Manet family, for example. And he creates a market for these unfinished works. And I think it's really at his urging that she goes back and adds some of those dark, scrawling signatures, the moment when her vision is beginning to fail her, as she kind of reevaluates those earlier unfinished things. Yeah. If you can project, I can repeat. What happened to the mural?
Wouldn't we all like to know? Wouldn't we all like to know? It's unclear. An incredible art historian named Sally Webster has written the definitive book on this mural and includes a kind of coda about searching for the mural and sort of setting out a couple possibilities for what might have happened to it. You know, there's the hope survives that it's just rolled up somewhere in some library in Chicago, and I truly hope that someone accidentally trips over it one day and finds out. But it's really unclear, unfortunately.
The question is, when does she start doing something upside down and backwards with pastels? Are you maybe thinking of counterproofs? Yeah. Do you want to field this one? So I'm not sure of the chronology of her taking counterproofs of pastels, but she's an artist who is very, very interested in the 18th century. And her whole pastel practice is informed by her study of 18th century artists who work in this medium. People like Maurice Contin-Latour and Rosalba Carriera. And certainly the pulling of counterproofs from drawings is very much a part of the working process of a number of 18th century artists. Maybe Nikki has something to add?
I'll just add that sort of pursuant to what you were talking about, okay, that mic works now. This was my memory is serving, this is something she starts doing kind of at Vollard's behest and perhaps prodding. And I think what it shows is that she, again, was unabashedly in pursuit of financial success and wanted her work in circulation. She was a very savvy manipulator of her own market, and why sell one work when you can sell two? And so I think there is a level of play there.
This is a terrific question. So the question is, if Cassatt is a member of the French Impressionist movement, if her career, half a century of her career really unfolds in France, why have so few of her works ended up in the United States? I mean, in France, why have so many of her works ended up instead in American collections? I think here again, the answer has to do with the market and how her work was initially marketed. Nikki, do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Well, I think, it has a lot to do with her main dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, the great dealer to the Impressionists, who I think his commitment to her work was uneven. I think that in many ways he saw her as more of a means of connecting with wealthy American collectors in order to create a market for other artists in his stable. And so his marketing of her work happens mostly in the United States and mostly perhaps as a way for him to forge connections with wealthy American collectors with whom he hopes to place works by Degas and Monet and others. And I think this was a source of enormous frustration to her. One of the reasons why she becomes involved with Ambroise Vollard in the early 20th century is, I think, that Vollard sells a lot of her work within France. That's something that he's prepared to do, and that Durand-Ruel really put very little energy into.
Yeah, I'll only add that she was, and I say this with all the love in my heart, she was an absolute snob and had a great snobbishness about American art. And there's a great letter she's responding to a request to exhibit in New York, and this is in the late 1870s. And she writes back and she says, no, thank you, but I really support you, and I really think that one day American art will be something, and maybe one day New York might have something to offer art. Maybe you keep going. It was so condescending. So I think, yes, she was deeply embittered about this. And the only other thing I'll add is that while it's true that the majority of her works are in the United States, it's also true that in a lot of museums, her works are seen in the context of the American collections. So most museums are divided into national schools, and very few museums treat her as a properly French artist. And this is a great source of sort of scholarly debate and consternation about whether she was French, whether she was American. Why it can't be both, I'm not sure, when she's so fervently identified as French in terms of her artistic identity, but then again maintained a really strong social network with American colleagues and friends and politics as well.
I'm interested a little in her relationship to other, famous Impressionist painters. I don't know too much about her. Did she work closely in tandem with them? Was she accepted by them as a colleague?
So the question is, how close were her relationships with other members of the Impressionist circle? Did she work closely with them, and what were her relationships with them like? Nikki, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Yeah, very close, very, very close indeed. She had a particularly close working relationship with Degas. He admired her work greatly, and it was a mutual respect. It's also true that she was also very close with Berthe Morisot, one of the other strong female artists of that circle. And as Emily,
the only female founding member of the Impressionists.
Yes, indeed. And it's also true that, as Emily mentioned, she worked closely with Pissarro on this print journal that ultimately failed, as well as Félix Bracquemond and Degas himself. So yes, she was absolutely in this circle. I think she came in halfway through the slew of Impressionist exhibitions, but worked very closely with them and socialized with them, and had very close working relationships with the artists that we now know as the Impressionists.
So the question is partly to do with Cassatt's backgrounds and the way that she tends to sort of blur out everything that's happening around the sort of intimate relationships between women and children that sort of form the center of her practice. Yeah, thoughts on this?
Well, sorry, the question was multi-part, so I'm trying to figure out which part to take on first. So I think she was deeply invested in, and interested in the domestic space in terms of her interest in textiles, as you mentioned, really was deeply inspired by her exposure to Japanese prints. But I think you're right that she was a figure painter through and through, and I think that this has to do, first of all, with the fact that she was just so good at it. And why would you why if it ain't broke? But she also understood that this is what you have to do if you're going to be in the art history books. This is the legacy she's responding to and creating for herself. As she said, she wants to paint better than the old masters. Whether this is excludes other genres like landscape, I think she just wasn't quite as interested in it. There are some really beautiful outdoor figure paintings that she does, but I think she was someone who was deeply interested in the sort of psychological interiority of her sitters of all genders. There are plenty of portraits of men and young boys as well. Actually, some of her most poignant pictures of women with children are with young boys, not just young girls. So I want to push back a little on this idea that she wasn't interested in male sociability. I think she was. She was very close with her brother. She was close with her father. She had many male colleagues that she was close with. But, I think her letter to the organizer of the Women's Building in 1893 really says it all. She recognizes that for so long, men had been this single subject of interest of psychological depth for portrait painters, and she was interested in correcting that imbalance. So I don't think that it was a sort of scorn for men, but I do think that she found women incredibly interesting and worthy of representation.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Nikki. I think we might have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it very much. Here's my question, and that is, I'm curious about how this exhibit came to be and the relationship that the two of you have together. The second question is there anything that really surprised you in putting this together? And it could be different for each of you.
Oh, what a wonderful question. So this is an exhibition originated by our wonderful colleagues, Laurel Garber and Jennifer Thompson in Philadelphia, and that really grew out of their permanent collection, which has such tremendous breadth and depth in this kind of, the work of this hometown heroine, a daughter of Pennsylvania, Cassatt. And so it's a project that Jenny certainly had been working on for years, and I had been very excited to sort of hear bits and pieces about. It was an exhibition that was not originally going to travel, but when their institution decided that it could go on to a second venue, I think Tom and I were very eager to put up our hand and say, could we please share it with West Coast audiences? And so I've been working on it really only for the last year, which has been a total joy for me, precisely because of this issue that Nikki has put her finger on as a French specialist. I've never really gotten to sink my teeth into the work of Cassatt before, because she's usually sort of stolen away by American specialists. And so actually to really get to delve into her work has been such a joy. I would say that I have come away from this project feeling tremendous admiration for her as a printmaker, and just a new understanding of how radically experimental she was in print media. But Nikki wrote a revelatory essay for the catalog on sale at our bookstore.
While supplies last.
Nikki, what are the surprises of this project for you?
Oh, that's such a great question. That's a really generous, lovely question. Thank you so much. And I'll say that I had the pleasure of being in on the sort of initial conversations that Jenny and Laurel were having in Philadelphia. I sort of elbowed my way in as politely as I possibly could, because Cassatt is an artist that I feel passionately about and just love to work on, and I really sometimes feel like I sort of live in conversation with her at this point. And she's a harsh critic, but she's good fun. She's good company. And I think what is so special about Jenny and Laurel and now Emily's approach to this show and the question of centering the theme of work is that, as we've seen today, her legacy is really overshadowed by the way in which we very easily and historically have layered the language of sentimentality onto images of women and children. So sweet, so nice. And they are those things. It's very sweet, it's very nice, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that sort of effaces the seriousness of how seriously she took her subjects and how seriously she applied her own vigor and work. The surprises for me in this exhibition, well, certainly just the chance to see this amount of work together at once is extraordinary. I will admit, don't tell anyone, this is just between us as friends. I cried a number of times in the show because it felt overwhelming to see her work brought together for the first time in my lifetime, not in my lifetime, but in my professional lifetime, I'm not that young, in this volume. And, it's true that she still just hasn't been given the stage in a meaningful way. And so I think even though I spend so much time looking at her work and thinking about her, seeing it all in one room, it moved me in a way that I can't express. That was the surprise, was the affective charge. And I know that's sentimentalizing, but we're not going back. That's not what, it's really about seeing her represent herself, taking herself seriously as an artist, and seeing how much this thread of the question of work and labor, which is something that I'm interested in my scholarship broadly, really is a consistent through line throughout her entire career and throughout her voluminous correspondence as well.
Well, many thanks to you all for being here with us today. I hope you have a chance to spend a bit more time in the exhibition, and just renewed thanks to you, Nikki.
Thank you so much, Emily.